Good morning and welcome. I'm Jeff Rathke. I'm the president of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins University. And I'm really delighted to have some excellent speakers and a great discussion ahead of us today. I love even starting from the title, what worked. We are going to take a look today at the economic policies for Germany, the United States, and more broadly, what the emerging scholarship suggests about the effect of those policies and what lessons we can draw from it. This is a really timely session, and I think it's going to be a great discussion. So I'm going to get out of the way of that discussion and hand things over to my colleague, Senior Fellow and Director of the AICGS Geoeconomics Program, Peter Rashish. Peter, take it away.
Thank you, Jeff. And thank you also to our panelists today and to all of you for tuning in. As Jeff alluded to, the US and German economic systems are both faced with an extraordinary supply crisis and as well as a demand crisis that accompanied the COVID-19 pandemic. And it required them to rely on established policy responses in part, but also to create new economic tools in a way as they were going along. And so we will explore how these economic and social policies in Germany and the United States that were called on worked, or what worked best, what could have worked better, and try to draw some lessons if and maybe perhaps when the United States and Germany face a similar crisis in the future. This webinar is part of a broader AICGS project called The Importance of the Transatlantic Partnership in Times of Global Crises, which is generously funded by the Federal Republic of Germany's European Recovery Program of the Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Action. We will have 3 speakers today. Each of them has also authored an essay related to the focus of our webinar, which I encourage you to look for on the AICGS website once they are posted in the coming days. Let me introduce our speakers briefly now. Björn Bremer is a senior researcher in international and comparative political economy at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Societies in Cologne. He holds a PhD from the European University Institute, and his research lies at the intersection of comparative politics, political economy, and political behavior. He's particularly interested in the politics of macroeconomic policies, welfare state politics, and the political consequences of economic crises. Sidney Rothstein is assistant professor of political science at Williams College. He studies the political economy of wealthy democracies in comparative perspective, focusing on Europe and the United States, and his current research examines the politics of digital transformation. He is co-editor of Imbalance, Germany's Political Economy After the Social Democratic Century, author of Recoding Power, Tactics for Mobilizing Tech Workers, and his research has appeared in the British Journal of Industrial Relations, German Politics, Review of International Political Economy, and other journals. He holds a BA in Political Science from Reed College and a PhD in Political Science from the University of Pennsylvania. Ines Wagner is research professor at the Institute for Social Research in Oslo. Her research focuses on equal pay for work of equal value, the double mobility of capital and labor in the European single market, and technological change and the quality of work. She has held fellowships at AICGS, the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Societies in Cologne, and the European University Institute in Florence. She has been published by Cornell University Press and in media outlets such as The Guardian and Harvard Business Review. Each of our panelists will speak for about 10 minutes this morning, and after that, we'll have a moderated discussion, and then we'll open things up to your questions. If you have a question, please use the Q&A tab on your Zoom screen. Today's session is on the record. Bjorn, let me hand it over to you to start.
Great, thanks so much, Peter, and thanks so much for the invitation here. In sort of what I'm going to say, I will mostly focus on fiscal policy, so my area of expertise. And I will also mostly focus on Germany, because in Germany, what you could have imagined actually coming into the crisis, that actually given Germany's rigid fiscal rules that were introduced a decade prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, actually Germany could have been very constrained in how the country responds to the crisis. The crisis could have actually been too much for the country to deal with, given that we in Germany have a constitutional debt break, given that all political parties cherish sort of the black zero, the schwarze null, and everybody seemed to really reluctant to use countercyclical policy and also going into debt in order to manage demand within Germany. But what we did see then actually in response to the pandemic was actually that pragmatism prevailed. Germany was ready to actually change its fiscal policy regime, at least to a certain extent, right? So what happened was that the constitutional debt break was suspended as a result of what the government, the federal government, but also the state governments were able to spend a huge amount in response to the pandemic to combat the economic fallout from the pandemic. And in fact, also Germany overcame skepticism at home against or towards a European action, and actually pushed jointly with the French for a European recovery fund, sort of which helped to boost not only Germany's but the entire European response to the crisis, right? And so we could say that this actually worked. Right, Germany's response in that sense was much more pragmatic than ideological in the first place. I think in hindsight, we know that this allowed Germany to weather the storm relatively well, the economic storm, at least from the pandemic. And so the question now that we have to ask ourselves is whether this actually led to sort of a fundamental paradigm change, whereby Germany's fiscal policy will also look different in the years to come. And so there are a couple of indications that this could be the case. On the one hand, we saw that the new coalition government that was elected in September last year, September 21, actually seems to be more pragmatic when it comes to debt as well. And also they agreed to reinstate the debt break. They pledged to return to the debt break in 2023. They actually proposed further borrowing for this year, for 2022. And they also set up a special fund with 60 billion to combat climate change and finance the country's digitalization. Right? So this is the so-called Climate and Transformation Fund, which draws actually on unused borrowing that was originally earmarked to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. And in fact, this is sort of a pet move of the new coalition government, because the government has just announced, in response to the Ukrainian war, they've announced to set up another special fund that circumvents the traditional debt break of worth 1 billion euros, which essentially allows the government to issue the debt today and then draw on this money, on the 1 billion in the years to come, in order to increase military spending in response to the unfortunate war that we've seen. And so the question that I was to ask myself then is this really enough going forward? And has Germany learned the lessons of the crisis? And there are actually a couple of reasons why this might not be the case, and I will focus on three of them. So first of all, the main reason that I think Germany has not learned the lesson sufficiently is actually that this really seems to be a technocratic fix, the sort of issuing of transformational funds, but also the suspension of the debt break. It really means that Germany gives itself the freedom to spend in some areas, but not in others going forward. And this is problematic not only when it comes to specific areas where you might not see enough spending, but it's actually also problematic for example, if you want to combat climate change or digitalize the country, because by preventing, for example, government to spend by hiring new staff, you also undermine the capacity of the government to actually implement the very projects for which you've generated fiscal space in these special funds that were set up. And the second problem that exists, however, is that actually, even though now the federal government has room to spend in the years because of these special funds in specific areas, this is not necessarily true for the state governments in Germany. And in fact, the state governments are much more constrained by the constitutional debt break than the federal government, because the federal government is still allowed to borrow a little bit under its constitutional debt break that will come in next year, but the states are not. And so some states have also made provisions for this. They've also used the COVID pandemic, so the fact that the constitutional constitutional debt break was suspended to give themselves fiscal freedoms, but others have not. And this will actually mean that going forward, we will see a greater inequality in the provision of services and public goods across Germany, which is already an existing pretty severe problem. And namely that we have a huge inequality in sort of, for example, investment spending, but also in sort of any other kind of social services for which the states themselves have to levy funds, for which they do not get the funds from the federal government. And third, I think what the German policymakers have not learned as a result of the pandemic yet is actually that there's room for more. What we've seen historically is, and a lot of economists like Olivier Marchand have pointed out this, is that the interest rates on German government bonds have steeply declined over time. And so even so, we already now entering a new period where there's inflation is coming back and interest rates are increasing. If you look at the historical comparison to what the interest rates were sort of 40, 50 years ago, Germany actually still has huge amount of room to issue further debt and finance government spending today relatively cheaply. And so I think that's something that other policymakers have understood, the sort of argument that in times of low interest rates, debt sustainability has to be thought about differently, but it's something that apparently German policymakers have not understood yet. And so I think going forward, this is something that hopefully will change, but it is one indication for me that actually, even though the short-term response of the German government to the pandemic in fiscal terms was relatively successful, it has not led to sort of any kind of rethinking, fundamental rethinking in terms of paradigm change. It will mean that also Germany is open to other kind of fiscal policies, not only at home, but also in Europe more broadly in the years to come. I think I'll leave it here for now, but I look forward to, first of all, the input by Sid and Ines, and then all your questions and comments on this. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Bjorn. So it sounds like from what you're saying, to borrow a phrase that's been used more in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and German policy, it's not sure yet there's a Zeitenwende in German fiscal policy. Sid, let me turn it over to you now.
Sure, thanks, Peter, and thanks everyone at AICGS for organizing this, and thanks, Bjorn, for leading us off. I'm going to pivot our focus a little bit, mostly to the United States, but also keeping the comparative lens. And I want to focus my remarks on comparing not just the US and Germany and their recovery efforts from the pandemic, but also the recovery efforts from the last crisis, or one of the last crises, because which one, right? But certainly from the financial crisis. I think that we can draw some lessons from the financial crisis in comparison to the COVID crisis. So one of the things that we're seeing already this year is that the US is sort of pulling ahead of many other countries when it comes to economic recovery. By the end of last year, so by the end of 2021, US GDP was up 5%. Germany GDP was up 0. However, at the same time, things aren't really going that well in the United States. If you actually ask people how they're feeling, 40% of the adult population is reporting anxiety and depression. And among people who are 18 to 24, so young adults, that number is 56%. So people are not feeling good. And one of the questions I think we have to ask ourselves as social scientists and as policymakers should also be asking themselves, so if the recovery is going so well in the United States, then why does everybody feel so terrible? And I think that my answer would be that the policies, the national policies that have been put in place are not enough, and perhaps to suggest that national policy might not actually be the level of politics where we would even observe the kind of recovery that we need to see. It is important to emphasize that policymakers in the United States did put in place extensive social policies during the pandemic. We had policies put in place here that were just not even remotely considerable, not even remotely politically feasible outside of a pandemic crisis situation. There were tax credits, child tax credits. There was extremely bolstered unemployment compensation. There was the direct cash payments to everybody in the United States. Student loan payments were suspended. There was support for tenants to pay rent. There was a moratorium on evictions. There was a whole raft of policies to keep businesses afloat and to keep people alive. And by about April of 2021, these policies had cost the US about 27% of GDP. So a lot of money, and I'm going to come back to that number in a second. It's important to emphasize the US is not the only country that poured a lot of money into their pandemic response. So Germany also spent a lot of money. They spent about 20% of GDP by April of 2021 on their own social policies. And Germany already had social policies, but they extended them much further than they had already been. Unemployment compensation was no longer means tested. Repeating the playbook from the 2008-2009 crisis, German policymakers instituted Kurzarbeit, the short-time work policies to preserve workers' employment relationships, and pumped a lot of money, for instance, into the arts, giving direct payments to freelancers, for instance, to make sure that things just like didn't fall apart. And the logic behind both the policy framework in the United States and in Germany was, well, if we can just bridge this crisis, if we can just get through this period, we'll be fine because the infrastructure, the underlying economic infrastructure is solid. So we just need to get back to where we were. But that's not entirely what was going on. And we get some hints of this with President Biden's plan to, quote, build back better, which recognizes that actually maybe we don't want to return to the world that we came from. And in fact, maybe we cannot return to the world that we came from. In the United States, that's a little bit clearer why we can't do that. So this is, I think, where we turn to what happened since the last crisis. So from 2009 to 2019, the top quintile of earners in the United States, not even talking about the top 1%, not even talking about the top 0.1%, all of whom saw many more gains, just the top quintile, their incomes increased by 25% in this period. No other realm of earners earned this much, saw this much gain, recovered so well in this period. It is true that in this period, the poverty rate was decreasing. And in 2019, the US actually recorded the lowest poverty rate on record for African Americans since 1959. However, that number is still 18.8%. Among white people in the United States, that number was 7.3%. This is a land of massive inequality, and that inequality has grown. In Germany, we see similar inequality. Work by colleagues Jan Behringer and his co-authors have shown that inequality in Germany has increased faster than in the United States, especially among at the high end of the income distribution. And I think in both the US and Germany, we can see the sheer magnitude of the resources committed to recovery illustrates just how much of a gap needs to be filled, just how desperate the situation is for so many people. In the United States, that 27% of GDP, that's about $4.6 trillion, which is a lot of money. I can't even really think about how many zeros are in that number. It's a lot of money, but it still pales in comparison to the amount of money owned by the 10 richest people in the United States, which at the beginning of this year was $1.3 trillion. So again, there's, and as a study by Oxfam and others has shown, the people who have recovered best from this crisis are the same people who have recovered best from the last crisis, that is, the top earners, the people who are already wealthy. If there's one group of people who is most familiar with the shortcomings of the recovery from the last crisis, it's the people who are 18 to 24 years old today. They were brought up in a world where they were told they need to go to college in order to be successful, but at the same time told that they need to make massive sacrifices in order to do so, to take on huge amounts of student debt and to navigate all of the intricacies and financial traps in the student debt market. So it might not be as much of a surprise that they're the ones who are facing higher rates of anxiety and depression in the current period. So what is to be done? The US did pass a whole bunch of social policy during the pandemic, and so did Germany. But both of these governments treated social policy as a temporary fix to what is actually a structural and long-festering problem in both places. So maybe social policy isn't the way that we're going to address these structural issues. At least it looks like maybe it's not possible to do so. One of the things that separates this recovery from the last one is a huge surge in labor militancy, especially in the United States. We've seen over the past few months, some commentators have been focusing on the Great Resignation, but there is also a massive push for organizing at some of the most iconic businesses in the United States, including Starbucks, where workers have filed union elections at more than 200 locations across the United States. At Amazon, workers mobilized and organized and won a massive union election at the company's Staten Island facility in New York. And many of the organizers in both of these companies are young, many of them are immigrants, and many of them are facing a choice that's all too clear. The question is, do you want your kids to be working this job? What can we do to make sure that our kids don't work this job? And the answer is not national policy, the answer is organizing. One thing that makes organizing really attractive, especially right now, is the direct support that it provides workers. They're not waiting for a temporary fix from policymakers. They're not waiting for means-tested social policy that might actually not give them the benefits they need to feed themselves and their families. Organizing is providing networks of support for workers. And one of the things that we see at both Starbucks and Amazon is that workers not only organize to exercise a voice in their workplace, to pressure management, to improve their benefits and pay, but also to listen to each other and support each other in what is a very, very difficult time in the United States and also in Germany. So all it is to say, I think that what we're seeing in the path of this recovery, first, one of the lessons from the last recovery, from the perspective of this one, is it might be too soon to tell who's coming out on top here. And the second one is, what we really need here is transformative change. Social policy can't be temporary. The pandemic showed us what's possible in terms of social policy, but nothing transformative is going to be passed unless people mobilize, unless people organize. And what we're starting to see in workplaces across the United States is precisely the movements that are possible for building that kind of popular support. So I would suggest that one of the lessons from the recovery is, and I think this can be applied to Germany as well, is that the path to a society and economy that serves human needs rather than profits runs through the workplace. So thanks very much, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Sid. So it sounds like you need to have bottom-up policies or actions to complement things that are coming top-down from governments. Ines, over to you now.
Thank you so much for the kind invitation and for allowing me to speak specifically to labor market policies. Peter, I have prepared some slides. Shall I share them, or I can also do without them? You let me know. You're muted.
You can try.
No, I'm not allowed to share my screen, but that's okay. It's
all right.
disabled. Okay, so I was going to start off with just a few numbers on the impact of COVID. I mean, I don't have to go into depth here, but maybe just to give us a baseline and how far jobs and businesses were affected specifically at the start of the pandemic. So in Germany, we've seen specifically in the second quarter of 2020, 9.7% drop in GDP, and in the US in the second quarter, a 9.1 drop in GDP. So that's sort of the historical height of what we've seen in the drop of GDP so far. So accordingly, certain policy responses were adopted, but also designed in Germany and the US to lend support to businesses and workers, right? And Sid already mentioned Kurzarbeit, short-time work, and the PPP, the payment protection Paycheck protection program. So what I'll do more specifically, I suppose, than the others is go really into looking at those policy tools, mostly looking at short-time work, and then end briefly with some reflections on how that relates to the Paycheck protection program. So Sid also mentioned that the short-time work program was, of course, already in place pre-pandemic. And what it basically does is that employers reduce employees' working time whilst workers receive the equivalent of unemployment benefits. And the replacement rate pre-pandemic for the hours worked of the workers was 67% for those with children and 60% without dependents. So this was then deemed insufficient, an insufficient response to the crisis that was induced by the COVID-19 pandemic, and certain changes have been made. So what we've seen is that the percentage was lifted, and also the time span was prolonged. So now the replacement rate of hours worked was, depending on the month work. So from the 4th month, 70 to 77%, and from the 7th month, 80 to 87%, and the time span prolonged to 21 months. And what I should also mention is that also already pre-pandemic, with the 60%, which, compared to the Paycheck protection program might seem a lower number or percentage, in certain sectors that is topped off by collective bargaining agreements in Germany. Not all sectors, but some that increase the effective amount the worker will receive at the end of the month. And now for the first time, this whole tool of short-time work was developed for the export-oriented manufacturing sector, right? But now, for the first time in the pandemic, also certain adjustments were made that were deemed to be more inclusive for other sectors in the labor market. So temporary agency work was included. Certain administrative structures were eased, that service job workers could more easily draw on short-time work, for example. And then as a result, we had an uptake of 7.3 million workers who took up short-time work in May of 2020, and that's compared to 1.5 million who took up short-time work in 2008-9 during the financial crisis. So certain adjustments have been made, but it should also be noted that a number of inequities are still noticeable. So first of all, the service sector jobs, a lot of them are not covered by collective agreements. Hence, that 60 to 70% range would effectively actually not be enough for the workers to continue daily and living expenses. So oftentimes those workers move to draw on unemployment benefits instead. Then secondly, there are entire or large share of sectors in Germany, such as construction, meat processing, where large parts of the workforce is outsourced to foreign-based companies. Those foreign-based companies or non-German companies are also not allowed to draw on short-time work. So we really have a sectoral inequities as to whom can draw on it, but also which skill level can draw on it. Marginal employment in Germany is not part of short-time work. Marginal employment is mainly done by, it's a feminized workforce, it's a migrant workforce. So there are these inequities that have not been addressed. There were proposals to adjust that, but that was not adopted by the Grand Coalition at the time. So the consequence being that for social and migrant and lower skilled workers, social protection clearly has been weaker in the pandemic as a response. Now let us have a look at the US Paycheck protection program in comparison. The amounts of the funds of the UPP, if you look at it, are 100%. So there's clearly a difference in the amount of funding, but the structure is a very different one. Well, first of all, it's been newly created, and this new creation has seen that the administration of the loans, goes via the private sector, whereas in Germany it goes via the state sector. Obviously, you already had those administrative procedures in place, which eased the access to those loans. But also in the private sector, you saw that certain decisions were then made as to who would be available to access those loans. Whereas in Germany, it's a general right to draw on those, on the short-time work. Then also the PPP loans, they're designed to cover payroll and operating costs, and short-time work only covers payroll costs. And businesses can then draw on other loans for the operating costs, meaning that the funds received will be passed on to the workers and not be spent on operating costs. So that's another difference. Then in the US, in addition to the PPP program, there was another aid package introduced that expanded the unemployment benefits, excuse me. And those two programs effectively started to compete. So one would either draw on the Paycheck protection program or on unemployment, on this unemployment aid package, which effectively turned out that for those who were in lower paid, lower skilled jobs, it was more attractive to actually draw on the unemployment benefits and not have this opportunity to get similar short-term work schemes to stay in employment and have a continuous employment relationship. So very short run through the German Kurzarbeit and the PPP. I think what I suppose I wanted to get at is that even though the size is a more substantial one in the US, the structure is very different. So not only the amount that is being paid out, but the structural conditions are very important. But then equally, if we look at Germany, even though there have been adjustments and this policy recognition finally that not everything, not the whole German labor market relies on export manufacturing and the automotive industry, the costs of the pandemic really have been socialized and passed on to certain segments in the labor market that are still unprotected. So on that note, I will end, and I'm looking forward to questions in the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ines. And let me start a conversation based on something you said, but also in a way something that well, actually that everyone said, but just what you just said, you pointed out, and I think it's quite interesting that that Kurzarbeit was sort of envisaged and still really primarily is focused on the export sector in Germany, workers in the export sector. Of course, that's where Germany has a exports play a preponderant role in the German economy. Some people even talk about it for sort of a German economic model, you know, based on export prowess. And Björn, you also mentioned, you talked a bit about, you know, whether or not you asked the question whether or not there really has been or will be a paradigm shift in the German economy. And Sid, and also I think you also addressed some of the same issues in the United States about, you know, whether the measures the U.S. government adopted during the pandemic really helped or will lead to building back better, differently, or whether it was really just a way to manage a crisis without any long-term shift. So my question is, and let me maybe let's start with Germany. And I don't want, and Ines, since you were the last to speak, you did say that Kurzarbeit was adapted a bit to make it more, you know, helpful for workers outside of the sort of a very large export sector. But do you think the process of doing that in Germany has had any impact on the debate in Germany about the German economic model? Do you think that the effect of the pandemic and being so reliant on exports and the fact that the government had realized, oh gosh, we've got to adapt our policies to take care of this other parts of the economy. Is that leading to any kind of, do you see that leading to any kind of longer term thinking about changing the makeup of German social and labor and economic policies?
Yes, thank you, Peter. I think it's more a long overdue policy recognition, and it did not go far enough. I mean, the fact that only now temporary agency workers were deemed, well, included in that policy, but not large parts of the rest of the labor market, is rather a weak sign. Even though I don't want to downplay, I mean, I'm glad it sort of at least moved along into that direction. But I think it does not go far enough. And specifically this acknowledgement that we have large parts of the labor market with certain characteristics, so migrant workers or the feminized sector, that is still sort of stuck in this male breadwinner model to a certain extent. And I think it's more to do with the change of recognition of that work that first has to happen. And I don't see that really happening at the moment, even though I don't want to be overtly pessimistic, because again, I do think maybe it's more of an incremental change and an overdue acknowledgement rather than now really a stepping stone towards something different. But of course, there was also a different government at the time. So that would also be, another question if this potentially is to continue, who knows, with the different government, or another sort of crisis comes into play with that government in place. That would also be an interesting question to observe.
Yeah. Björn, I mean, you spoke to a similar kind of issue, but having to do with the fiscal policy realm. And it sounded to me like you were, at least for the moment, skeptical that there has been really any kind of longer term paradigm shift in how Germany approaches kind of the balance between, having a more investment driven economy and a more export driven economy. And maybe picking up on what Ines just said, I mean, do you think that the new government, you mentioned some of the things the new government's doing, but do you think the presence of this new government has the potential to shift the, let's say, sort of center of gravity in German policymaking? Too soon to tell, or really the pandemic experience was just a one-off and it really doesn't look like it's going to lead anywhere?
Thanks. I mean, I think this is a tough question. I would generally agree with Ines that I think there was a lot of change that was overdue by the time the pandemic hit, but I think I agree with her also that the reckoning hasn't gone far enough. So I think we do see some changes. I mean, and there was certainly also discussion, for example, about the problem of supply chains and supply chain collapsing. And there were discussions about the fact that Germany cannot go it alone. So I think that sort of was one of the reasons why we saw a more European response than maybe in the decade before, when Germany played like the tough guy in the context of the Eurozone crisis. But I mean, as I also tried to highlight when it comes to fiscal policies, but I think also more broadly when it comes to the economic policies that Germany adopts, I don't think it has gone far enough. And that's probably also because Germany actually has, as a result, and that's again similar actually to what happened in 2009, 2010, Germany actually rebounds relatively well after sort of the immediate shock in 2010 as a response to the pandemic. Probably it rebounds better than many had expected. And so as a result, I think not many people are questioning this fundamental focus of Germany's economy based on exports. I think when it comes to the new government, there's of course one party that could play a little bit of a transformation role. That's sort of the Greens, and they could of course try to move towards the sort of a more sustainable, investment-driven economy. But I mean, they're very much, at least when it comes to domestic economic policies, they're constrained by the other two coalition parties. And so what I think we're seeing is a little bit of a shift on the margins, but we're not seeing a big shift whereby the German economic model is questioned by sort of the political mainstream, and whereby this then also leads to policy change that's adopted by the government. At least not yet.
And Sid, feel free to comment on Germany, but also in the United States. It sounds like you might agree with that conclusion, that it hasn't led to any fundamental rethink in sort of the US economic model to the extent there is one. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that in the United States it's a little bit more difficult to pin down what the economic model might be, just because there hasn't been a whole lot of economic dynamism there. I mean, I think I would mostly piggyback on what's been said so far. I would highlight maybe two themes that are useful, I hope. And one of them is the articulation of essential workers in both countries, but especially in Germany, and the organizing that's been done for, I guess, decades now by workers in the healthcare sector to try to get better benefits, better working conditions, and higher wages. And one of the things that's been, I think, most amazing to me in observing the crises, the multiple crises, is first the way in which the government, and granted mostly the previous government, moved very slowly in supporting their efforts, and eventually did help to win some wage increases for these workers and like support their efforts for collective bargaining. But then, shortly later, they very, very quickly committed a much larger sum of money to defense spending. And that contrast is, one cannot overlook it. If the money is there, it is surprising where it's going. And I guess this leads to the second point, as Bjorn's pointing out, the Greens could potentially make a difference here. In fact, it looks like all the cards are working in their favor. They have the finance ministry and they have the foreign ministry. They are part of a movement that sees care work and a lot of the essential work as one of the solutions to climate change. This is low carbon work. These are low carbon industries, like healthcare, for instance. I think one of the tragedies that we're seeing, usually the SPD seems to take on the tragic role in these kinds of crises. It seems like this time the Greens are the ones who are ending up passing all sorts of policies that are like fundamentally at odds with their core commitments. I'm not sure how to get out of that tragedy. I think part of it has to do with being constrained by coalition partners, but I do wonder about this question of social mobilization. If the recovery was too painless for too many people, but who wishes pain on people? And I think that, as Ines was pointing out, a lot of people have hurt in the pandemic in Germany. But they're so sufficiently disenfranchised by the political system that their voices aren't being heard by the politicians designing policy. It's certainly the case in the United States, this is true as well, but to the extent that the US is a debt-led model, there's a lot of, the statistics are confusing because household debt has decreased over the past few decades, or sorry, over the past few months, over the past couple of years. A lot of that has to do with people using their pandemic payments from the government to pay off debt. And a lot of it has to do with student debt payments being suspended. Whether that indicates a long-term change in the US economy, I don't think so, but we are seeing more economic concentration among giant internet companies and the increasing financialization. So it looks just like a doubling down on the type of economic model that leads to massive forms of inequality and especially wealth concentration at the top.
Bjorn, you, and let me just remind the viewers that if you'd like to ask the questions, to use the Q&A tab. Bjorn, you mentioned Germany's role in the European Union, and you mentioned that it, along with France, and this was a bit of a shift for Germany, it pushed for the next gen EU program, recovery program after the onset of the coronavirus pandemic. If you look at Germany and the EU over the last few years, let's say, I mean, and maybe trying to extrapolate from what you see now with the new government and the sort of current constellation in politically in the EU, do you see Germany's membership of the EU as, acting as an incentive or a disincentive to this kind of paradigm shift? And then I have a related but a little bit different question, which is, all three of you have talked about government policy and whether it's promoted or hindered inequality. And so, Björn, I'm just interested in, when you look at, say, at the European level, if you look at something like the Next Gen EU, is it too soon, or can you already say something about whether at the EU level, they're doing a better or worse job of dealing with this issue of inequalities?
Thanks, Peter. I mean, on your second question, I mean, Next Gen EU is, of course, one way for Europe to address some of the inequalities that exist, because of the way that the funds are distributed, but also because of the funds that they're not all loans-based, but they're also some transfer-based, right? So countries that are more in need of economic support, economic help, can actually draw on that support. There is essentially redistribution from, for example, countries like Germany to some of the weaker European countries, at least in economic terms. So say, for example, Italy. And so I think in that sense, Next Generation EU, of course, is pretty remarkable, and it has been a success that it really has overcome a stigma, something that had sort of didn't exist before. That's based both in terms of sort of debt financing at the European level, but also in terms of more openly and very clearly redistributive policies that have been agreed by all member states. I mean, don't get me wrong, there were redistributive policies. Most European policies have a redistributive element, but they weren't so formulated in this explicit way as the Pandemic Recovery Fund has been. I mean, when it comes to sort of whether or not, though, this is sort of a real transformation or not, I think that's difficult to tell again, as of now. I mean, my interpretation of Next Gen EU is that essentially German policymakers were actually looking at Europe in the spring of 2020 and the fallout from the pandemic, which of course hit some countries at that point much more than others. And they were really scared about what this would do to the both to the single market and the European single market, but also the Eurozone. And in that sense, of course, you could actually tell that, I think, by virtue of Germany's membership within the European project, and by the virtue of the importance of the single market and the Eurozone for Germany, actually the country and the government was ready to act in order to safeguard these mechanisms, right? To put it very plainly, very clearly, I think what happened in Italy and the discussions that were set up in Italy, where even the Italian prime minister sort of threatened to go it alone, which a lot of economists in particular saw as a threat of that Italy would be ready to lead the Eurozone, the European project altogether. That sort of triggered fears among German policymakers that this would also have a huge impact on, of course, the way the German economic model works. And so in that sense, actually, the fact that Germany is integrated into the European market, and the fact that you have a sort of an export-based economy, in this one particular instance, where fears of Italexit became very real, it I think actually helped Germany push change through. But I wonder to what extent this will happen again, given that sort of course, Italy at some point retracted from its extreme positions, dissatisfaction among Italy declined again with Europe. So it's not necessarily that next time the next crisis happens, Germany will respond in the same way, because maybe the threat of Italexit will not be so severe in that instance.
Ines, I think it's fair to say that the German Kurzarbeit program, which, as you say, has existed for several years, did have an influence on U.S. policymaking. I think there are people both in the executive branch and on the Hill who observed what Germany had in place and what it was doing, and I think that contributed to the thinking behind the Paycheck protection program. I guess a couple of questions. One is, do you see that Kurzarbeit in Germany playing that kind of role within the EU? Because I know other countries in the EU had some of those programs. I think it's also true that perhaps some countries didn't and then initiated programs like so. It's is it true that Germany during the crisis had a kind of role as a model also within the EU? And do you think that if that's the case, that countries are looking to Germany? What is it that Germany should be doing to make sure that everyone else gets it right?
Well, the short answer is I don't have a very good overview of it, but I do know, I mean, there are a lot of studies that come out that do compare the different programs that emerged during the pandemic and how they relate to short-time work. Of course, other countries already had short-time work also in place pre-pandemic. I mean, I happen to know for different reasons. I mean, I'm familiar with sort of the Norwegian context, but also I looked to Poland. I mean, Poland was a country that specifically looked to Germany and implemented and designed something that is also called short-time work, but effectively is not being used at all by the workers in the country. And I think sort of that process has started, and we certainly see if those structures have been in place already due to as a response to the financial crisis, for example, those have also been adjusted in most places. So there we sort of see a trend and continuous change and adaptation, but yeah, I'm not an expert to speak to all the other contexts to clearly mark out what works and what doesn't work in the other contexts. So I think it's sort of a similar exercise to look specifically, but it is something that appears to be a more concerted effort. But maybe Björn and Sid can talk more about or to that issue too.
Does anyone want to comment on that? If not, we have an interesting, go ahead, Sid.
Because I would just say, I think that the intuition behind the question is absolutely correct. And at least in the US, there's definitely this hope. I think everybody looked at Germany after 2008 and was like, how did you do that? How did you bounce back so quickly? And everybody wants to do that. But I think, again, what that wish conceals is the myth that there is something to bounce back to. And there's this assumption that what was happening before, everything was fine. And that's just not true. And it's especially not true in the US. I think that it's probably more true in Germany than it is in many other countries. But to the extent that countries adopt programs for temporary fixes rather than structural transformation, they're just sort of prolonging, to put it bluntly, the misery that most people are living under in that system of production.
We have an interesting question asking about the role of international coordination. Was the role of the G7, for example, or the G20, was there a strong role of international coordination through bodies like the G7 and the G20 on these kinds of issues that we are discussing? And would that kind of coordination, which is been there on a kind of macroeconomic level, but maybe less on social policies. But we are talking about fiscal policy, which is a bit more traditional sort of G7, G20 domain. I mean, was there scope for greater coordination? And if so, what's the lesson for, again, perhaps an inevitable next crisis? Björn, do you want to try to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, I agree that's a fascinating question, but I'm not sure I'm the best to answer it because I'm by no means an expert on sort of the G7, G20. My hunch is that that actually the response of the G7, G20 to the pandemic was not ideal, but that was not necessarily also to be expected to it be much better, right? Given that the pandemic was actually sort of this unprecedented event that policymakers, at least in the very beginning in spring 2020, were really overwhelmed by sort of the outbreak of the disease, that I think it was pretty clear from the very beginning that at least in the beginning, all responses to the pandemic were sort of national responses. And so in that sense, of course, there could have been much more coordination. Of course, it would have been much better to do things at the multilateral level often than at the national level. But I think that's asking a lot from policymakers, especially asking a lot if given the sort of the nature of the crisis, which was not an economic crisis or financial crisis, for which there have been playbooks, but was the sort of global pandemic for which sort of a playbook didn't necessarily exist. And so at least that when it comes to policy coordination at the global level, I think it's much more difficult than, for example, other kind of crises that we face. And so I think what this means, coming back to the question, I think it would be useful to develop other tools for multilateral cooperation, because we've seen that, for example, in the European Union, so where the networks were quick, it also took some time. You know, in March and April, everybody was preoccupied with their own response. But then actually come to May, June, July 2020, you could actually rely on the existing institution, the existing network, to set up a really European response that was stronger than just the national responses. And if that could be done at the international level, that would be great. But I think it's asking a lot of policymakers, at least in the current sort of institutional setup.
We have another question about labor mobility, in particular about the distinction between workers who are able to work remotely and those who are not. Has that been, was that and does that remain a factor for results that are not as equitable as we may wish? Did policy try to address that, and how could governments do better at addressing that issue? Ines?
Yes, thanks. That's an interesting question, and I think there's some nuances to that. But and I'm not sure about policy, but I think workers then face different issues. I mean, what we do see is those workers who were able to continue work, right, at home, work by computers and such, monitoring also increased. So that's an issue that is high on the agenda now for German trade unions, I'm sure for the US as well, but Sid can speak more to that. So the issue of monitoring and control has become high on the agenda. And then, of course, depending on your private situation, the combination, I mean, in Germany, for long stretches of time, childcare was closed. So how do you then deal with the expectation you have of continuing work whilst taking care of your children? So, I mean, all of those issues became part of the public discussions that were not addressed. I mean, in the early policy proposals, childcare wasn't even mentioned. So it's just what do you say? I mean, you kind of comprehend how one is expected to continue working, and policy doesn't even consider how to take care of these private situations. I mean, this can be care of any kind. Then you have, of course, workers who are much more faced with the health risks if you cannot switch to a home office and such. And also there, I mean, this, on the one hand, recognition of essential work and those workers not being matched by valuing them higher. I mean, if there's anything else that you need, I'm not sure what it is to actually see how much the economy depends on these types of works. In any case, so I mean, Sid also mentioned there's been some advancements here and there, but definitely not matched up by the visibility of the essentiality of the work that is being done. Plus, you had a lot of public discussions on the creation of migrant corridors for this essential work. So all the planes were empty, but Romanians and Polish workers were flown to Germany. Then also initiating discussions on xenophobia. So we have this importation of COVID, and so the spread of the virus because of these mobilities, even though they're there to fill essential gaps. So yeah, I'm touching on a lot of issues, but it's complex and an interesting discussion to be had.
Absolutely. Sid, maybe if you want, I'll give you the last word.
It's dangerous. I really like all the issues that Ines point to, and I think really important, especially childcare and especially monitoring, as well as the migration issue. The one thing I think that I would just add on is for the workers who are returning to work, the issues around safety in the workplace have been one of the huge sparks for organizing in the United States. So a lot of the folks at Starbucks who are organizing are organizing because they don't feel safe, because management isn't doing enough to keep them safe. And it's the same at Amazon as well. That's a bit harder to do when you're working from home, but I would just add that it does seem as though employers are not doing what they can to keep their workers safe, and they should do more. But the fact that they're not has been a spark for mobilization.
Well, thanks to everyone. Thank you, Björn Bremer. Thank you, Sidney Rothstein. Thank you, Ines Wagner, for this, I think, very wide-ranging and insightful discussion on a topic that is not going away and probably has to not go away if we're right that COVID was not just a one-off. Let me also thank once again the ERP program of the federal government of Germany for their support. Thank all of you for tuning in, and please do look for the papers by our speakers today, which we'll have on our website, and we'll also push out on social media. So thanks again for joining us, and have a good rest of your day.